Okay, this is the first time really I'm talking with a Russian about what's going on in Ukraine. Could you explain us why did Russia finally decided to go in Ukraine?
Well, this is, I think, historians will find it one of the biggest mysteries of the 21st century. How the relations between Russia and Ukraine, which seem to be, problematic, but which seem to be one of the smallest of Russia's problems until 2013, how did they degenerate into what we have now? And basically, I must tell you from the beginning, I hate conspiracy stories, but this one is interesting because obviously our President Putin, he underestimated the importance of Ukraine. He lost his grip on the situation for maybe a day or two in 2014 because he was busy with the Olympics. We had Olympic Games in Sochi at the time. And it was then that the Ukrainian nationalists, who grew into a powerful force, and Russia did not notice it, when Ukrainian nationalists seized power in Ukraine. It absolutely makes no sense to talk about the decision of Russia, the decision of Putin and his circle to send troops into Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 without that story, without the story how the rabid Ukrainian nationalists, almost Nazis, took power in the country in February 2014. The root is there, you know. And this is a very instructive story because until February 2014, Ukraine looked like a peaceful place. It was basically, in terms of violence, in terms of the danger of military action, it was one of the safest places in the former Soviet Union. People expected violence in Georgia, in Armenia and Azerbaijan, even in Moldova, which was poorer than Ukraine until 2014. They expected violence in Russian North Caucasus, anywhere in Central Asia, but not in Ukraine. Because Ukraine and Russia, these are two East European countries, very close to each other, just so that our audience can understand. In 98% of the cases, if I meet a Ukrainian person on the street and if we start speaking Russian, in 98% of the cases, I will not be able to tell you if he comes from Ukraine or from someplace in Russia. All Ukrainians speak excellent Russian. Most of Russians, including me, I think like 80%, those who have what we call a good brain for language, they understand Ukrainian 100%. A small minority may understand half of it, 1/3 of it, you know, just people who are not, who cannot guess, you know, what the other person means, who are not literate. They may not understand some of the Ukrainian, but Ukrainians will immediately recognize that we are not native speakers if we try to speak Ukrainian. So it is a very, very sad story, you know. There is a poem in Russian how a tragedy happens, you know. In the beginning, one of the horses just had bad horseshoes, you know. There was one nail missing in the horseshoe. So the horse fell during the battle. The horse fell under the commander, so the regiment is defeated. So the regiment is defeated, the army is defeated, the enemy enters the city, the country is defeated. The world crumbles. Why? Just because of one nail in a horseshoe, right? The same story with Ukraine. Basically, in February 2014, you know how the story started. President Yanukovych was not pro-Russian. This is one of the biggest lies that the Western media uses. He was not pro-Russian. He was a typical East European, Western-oriented president with very modest beginnings. He was from a very poor family. And like many people from poor families, he wanted to live a luxurious life. He wanted to live like people live in the West. And he was, people say he was corrupt. He was not more corrupt than the previous president, Yushchenko. He was not more corrupt than Kuchma, who had been ruling Ukraine for 8 years. In November 2013, one of the main bifurcation points was reached. Ukraine was supposed to sign or not to sign the association agreement with the European Union. And just to give you an idea how hypocritical the West is, later the West said, oh, he refused to sign the paper. We agree he had the full right not to sign it, but it was such a tragedy that people just rose up against him, and they killed and they died. They just wanted Europe. They wanted to join Europe so much. In reality, if you look at the newspapers, you will see that until the last moment, until November 2013, the European Union was pondering canceling signing that association agreement. They wanted to punish Yanukovych in that way for putting in jail Yulia Tymoshenko. She was their person. It's interesting. They recognized that she was very corrupt. She was much richer than Yanukovych. She was involved in the gas trade between Russia and the European Union via Ukraine. You can imagine it's a golden hand. You can make you would become very rich in a few days if you had any connection to that business. And she controlled that business for many years. So she was put in jail with absolutely good grounds by Yanukovych, but the West wanted her out. And it's amazing, in a few days, thousands of people were killed in Ukraine by the Ukrainian army. And the West, there was not a single word about sanctions, sanctioning the government that killed thousands of people. But there was a talk about sanctioning Ukraine for keeping just one person, one corrupt person, Yulia Tymoshenko, in jail. Just check it, you'll see before that Vilnius summit where Yanukovych asked, he did not refuse, he asked the European Union to postpone the signing of the agreement, maybe until April or May. He asked to compensate some of the losses that Ukraine would endure if it signed that agreement. And then the protests started, the so-called protests started. Putin's first mistake was that he did not send anyone. He did not get involved in any way. He expected the West to behave roughly in the same way. He said, it is Ukraine's internal matter. Mr. Yanukovych is actually in his right not to sign that paper. If people protest, that's up to them. That's a different country. The West was absolutely not honest. The West immediately sent all their bigwigs to support the protests. And Yanukovych was stupid enough to let them into the country and not to arrest them there. Actually, they were all committing a crime. Can you imagine? In the central Washington, you get a crowd that besieges the Capitol Hill, besieges the White House, and you read fiery speeches to them, being a foreigner, and you give money to them almost openly, and your media supports this kind of mutiny. So the West immediately breached all the rules, and Putin did not respond. He thought that Yanukovych would somehow control the situation. Russia just continued to help Ukraine economically, as it did for many years. And in February, it looked like they reached a compromise. There was a deal signed by Yanukovych and the opposition, represented by Klitschko and Yatsenyuk, the two men whom Victoria Nuland chose as Ukraine's future rulers. That she recognized that this conversation was genuine, the one that they recorded, where she decided who would be the prime minister, Yats or Klitsch. Yats was Yatsenyuk and Klitsch was Klitschko. So they both negotiated with Yanukovych. with the guarantors being Frank-Walter Steinmeier, now the president of Germany, an absolutely shameless man, as we see now. Next to him, Władysław Sikorski, Polish foreign minister, the husband of Anna Applebaum, just speaks for itself, and the French foreign minister, Mr.
Hola.
No, Holland was later the prime minister. Laurent Fabius. Laurent Fabius was the man who said that President Assad of Syria did not deserve to live on the planet Earth. Who the hell is he to decide who deserves to live on the planet Earth and who doesn't? Yeah. So they were all guarantors of that agreement, and according to the agreement, all violence should have stopped. The sides should return to their initial positions, and later that year, elections should be held. Okay, it was supported by the European Union, supported by the United States, supported, I think, even by the United Nations. So what happened was that the agreement was breached by Yatsenyuk and Klitschko hours after it was signed. It was not worth the paper it was signed on. And it was breached not by some protest action, it was breached by very violent action. They attacked the headquarters of Yanukovych's party and burnt it down with several people inside. And then they pressed ahead. Obviously, some people in Yanukovych surrounding betrayed him. They pressed ahead and there were no troops, and they entered the Rada, the parliament. From that moment, the Rada started to take absolutely different decisions, different from the ones it had been taken before. The West pretended that this is okay, they just changed their opinion. And Yanukovych had to flee his headquarters, as Mr. Kerry said later shamelessly. He just fled in the middle of the night. He fled because otherwise he would be killed, So this is the root cause of the problem. And Putin's fault is that he at that moment the Olympic Games in Sochi were drawing to a close. So all efforts, all eyes were on that moment, and the West used that, they used that moment that Putin was busy, and they did it. And this whole story grew into a huge problem because the east of the country did not recognize the seizure of power. They voted for Yanukovych. He was one of them. He was born in Makeyevka, which is bombed now by Ukrainian troops every second day. And they wanted their man in Kiev. They won the election. Why should they just, let someone else be in charge? And someone else was terrible. The 1/4 of the new government that was immediately formed after Yanukovych left, 1/4 were members of the Svoboda party, the party which even the Western media called Nazi, called them a Nazi party. There were all kinds of things there, prohibiting Russian language in Ukraine, prohibiting, introducing a visa regime with Russia, all kinds of things that were purely fascist. And then the tragedy started because the East rebelled. And yes, let's not hide that Russia supported them because the Ukrainian regime immediately moved troops against them, troops with tanks, airplanes, artillery, and Russia sent weapons and probably some instructors because it was just 5 million civilians. What was Donetsk and Lugansk? 5 million civilians, many of them elderly people, many of them former miners. Almost all of them, the male population served in the Soviet army. So they knew how to handle weapons, but they were not prepared for any kind of military activity. Most of them never were at war in their lives, maybe some of them in Afghanistan, but very few. And it was the real beginning of the war. The West prefers not to notice it. And the war continued for 8 years. Despite these Minsk agreements and despite the obvious need to stop the hostilities, actually there was a very good example. Moldova, which is located to the southwest of Ukraine, a much smaller country, Moldova managed to stop the fighting that erupted in August 1992 because The Slavic population there was afraid that Moldova would join Romania. They didn't want to live in Romania. So the fighting there stopped in 2 months, and the conflict was frozen, which meant that there were actually two states, but Transnistrians, mostly Slavs, they could go to Chisinau, they could fly from there by planes. Their president uses Chisinau for his foreign visits. So it was not such a cutthroat struggle as in Ukraine. And several attempts were made. Let's freeze this conflict. Let's stop it. It was the Ukrainian side that pressed ahead. They used every opportunity to get closer to Donetsk. The whole problem was that the fighting stopped in the outskirts of Donetsk. So the Ukrainian army had the possibility, it still uses it, to bombard Donetsk by shells and by missiles almost every day. So when they say, Russia just took that territory arbitrarily, if Russia could arbitrarily move, the Ukrainian troops away from Donetsk, maybe that second war would not have happened, because we still cannot make Donetsk safe after this year of fighting, because the most formidable positions the Ukrainian army has are near Donetsk. This is the center of the rebellion. And I remember I visited Ukraine several times after 2003. There was growing hatred. The east, the west of Ukraine and the center of Ukraine, the people in Kiev, they were propagandized by the Ukrainian media to hate Donetsk, because it was mostly Russian speakers, mostly the proletarians, the poor people who worked at the mines. Actually, it's a very pleasant city, southern nice city. I don't know why they hate it so much, but they made the word Donetsk a synonym for everything bad. It's like it's like Soweto in South Africa. It's like the poor quarters of Philadelphia in the United States, the people there rebelled because they understood that under this kind of government, they will not be even second-rate citizens. They will be third-rate citizens. This is why they were so determined to fight. So the war did not want to get frozen. And little by little, the Western countries got involved more and more. This is that story about the frog that jumped out of the hot water but let itself be boiled slowly. The reason why Putin decided to go in February, I think, is there was information, it was public, that basically even the Russian liberal newspapers agreed with that. Basically, the United States and the UK, they used the so-called training centers where they were training Ukrainian troops, thousands of them. They were becoming de facto NATO bases with modern weapons, with missiles. Poroshenko and later to a less extent Zelensky, Poroshenko bragged that his missiles in a few years would be able to reach Moscow. His missiles, no, but the Western missiles, yes. And there was a danger that they would be placed there in Achakov, on the Black Sea, next to Crimea. Putin had to kind of appease the passions in Russia, and he did it by reuniting with Crimea, which was an easy operation to do, because in Crimea the population was very pro-Russian for many years. You can check it in the Western newspapers. Now they say that no, but if you look at the Western newspapers in 1996, 1995, 1999, every time Crimea had an election, they tried to get closer to Russia, because Crimea until 1954 formally was a part of Russia. The only reason why Khrushchev decided to lump it with Ukraine was, the water issue. Crimea gets its water from the mainland, which is Ukraine, but it is a Russian region. And of course, when Russians suddenly started to realize that Ukraine is hostile and this is irreversible, and this is very dangerous, and this is going to continue, the only way to sugar the pill was to have Crimea. So I remember at the time the people here said that, our generation now has its 9th of May. 9th of May is the day of victory over Nazi Germany. But technically speaking, Crimea is 3% of the Ukrainian territory. So when the West said, oh, Putin wounded Ukraine, he inflicted terrible damage. No, it's 3% of the territory. And the other territory that Ukraine has it was one of the best developed areas of the Soviet Union in terms of agriculture, in terms of industrial production. A lot of metals, coal, very nice climate, Black Sea coast. So Ukraine had all the requisites for being a rich country, but there are two facts which I think would tell you volumes about the effect of Western help. Until 2020, until the Maidan happened, Moldova was the poorest country in Europe. That was recognized by the United Nations. Since 2015, after the 1 year after Maidan, Ukraine became the poorest country in Europe by far. And again, this is a UN estimate, it's not mine. So this is the result of Western help, of being in the Western zone of influence. But I want our viewers to understand that I still, everyone here is terrified when we watch and hear and we learn about the losses of that war in Ukraine. And of course, there is some estrangement and anger especially among the relatives of the soldiers. But in general, these are not foreigners for us. So for us, it's a terrible civil war. And the hope is that as soon as the regime in Kiev crumbles, the majority of people there would be happy. They would feel like they are returning to normal. Yes, maybe there will be some who will resist because they were journalists under that regime, they were officials. A lot of them, I'm sure, will be given another chance in their life by Russia. But still, the bulk of the population, the doctors, the teachers, the workmen, their life crumbled after Maidan. I know dozens of people who had to flee to Russia. Some of them fearing for their lives. Some of them just said, I don't want to live in the nationalist country. I don't want to feel myself as a second-rate citizen. I want to speak Russian. They fled to Russia. And maybe part of the reason why Putin decided to go, he did not expect so much resistance from the Ukrainian army. Part of the reason may be that he had so many friends, Ukrainian friends, who fled, including Mr. Medvedchuk, who promised that there would be little resistance, that people expect Russia and they would support the troops. They could be right. Maybe they were not lying, because this is the nature of the totalitarian regime. I think Nazi Germany and Stalin Soviet Union, they were very badly managed countries, very poor, very unhappy. People there did not feel happy. But they were formidable military powers, and they could resist pressure from outside until the end, because this is the nature of a totalitarian regime. It doesn't make people happy, but it is very resistant. It can mobilize a lot of military force, a lot of human resources to defend itself. And this is precisely the story with the Ukrainian regime.
Yeah. You see, there were 3 times that Putin was trying to solve this situation in Ukraine. First of all, as you mentioned, in 2014 and 2015, Minsk I and Minsk II, he tried to solve it with Ukraine and Germany and France. They were guarantors to those agreements. But it failed, it didn't work. In December 2021, he sent 2 letters to NATO headquarters, and Biden administration tried again to avoid this war, and he failed again. And we see after he goes in Ukraine, we see in March 2022, he started peace talks with Ukrainians again in Istanbul, in Turkey. And why do you think these talks were failed in Turkey, in Istanbul?
Well, you started it in a very interesting way, I think, when you said, what was Putin, what did he want to achieve? What did he achieve? I think this is very important to answer that question because it is seemingly devastating for Putin because a lot of people here in Russia, Putin's critics, they say, okay, he promised Donbas people peace. Never during the last 8 years was there so much fighting in Donbas. He wanted to stop the NATO expansion. NATO expanded on Finland and Sweden. That's what, the West loves to underscore. So just favors, no gains. No, I don't agree. First, the main goal of that operation was to stop the onslaught of the West. Basically the main conflict behind this whole story with Ukraine and the story with the Baltics and the story with Poland. The main story was that Cold War did not end properly. Gorbachev failed to end the Cold War properly. He just said, the war is over, Merry Christmas. It's very pleasant to say such things. You may get a lot of nice publicity, but this is not the way wars end. Usually when a war ends, you have a meeting of two negotiating teams. You have a document signed. Here is your territory. Here's your territory. Here is what we agreed to do and not to do. Okay, no Merry Christmas, just, the new world where we are living. And the Cold War, there was no document signed. There was no paper. It was just one side saying, oh, I'm tired. I'm tired of fighting you. I'm sure you don't hate me. Let's just be friends. No, things don't work that way. And immediately it transpired that Russia still sees itself as primarily the victor of World War II, and the West views Russia as primarily the loser of World War III, of the Cold War. And the problem was that it was not immediately clear where NATO would stop, because there was no paper signed in 1991. So Putin wanted to stop the onslaught of the West. And he did it because now in Ukraine we see that the wars of the 21st century, they will not be like the war in the Persian Gulf. The Americans had this illusion that actually their technical superiority is so complete that now they can win wars without losses, just sending drones or sending high precision missiles or planes. They would be able to destroy the enemy at a distance without any mobilization, without any blood on their side, of course. No, the war in Ukraine has shown, no, the war is going to be terrible. It's going to be very much like the First World War, even worse than the Second World War, with long trenches, with hundreds of thousands of people participating because the front line is so long. Lots of people are going to be killed. High precision weapons are not so effective and they're extremely expensive. You better have 10 old tanks than one new tank. The West is not prepared for this kind of war. Absolutely. It is like a bloody Cuban crisis. The Cuban crisis was very dangerous, very unpleasant, but it gave the Soviet Union 50 years of peace because the Americans were so scared that for the next 50 years, they didn't joke with their nuclear weapons. Only now they're losing their fear, And the war in Ukraine, it showed that, no, it's not going to be a no-contact fight. It's not going to be, the game with just one goal on our side. But it's going to be terrible. The West is not prepared, so for the next 20 or 25, maybe 30 years, the West will not be expanded militarily on Russian territory. This is the main result of this war.
But the problem,
the other things, I agree, they are not very impressive. Yes, Donetsk continues to be destroyed by the Ukrainian nationalists. Yes, Ukraine is not liberated. People suffer a lot. Yes, the good thing is that basically the West expected to make Russia crumble by sanctions, and here they miscalculated. Putin underestimated the Ukrainian army. The Americans underestimated the Russian economy and its non-dependence on Western economy. They thought people here cannot make anything with their hands. It's not true. So if you ask me what is the balance of good and bad, well, morally, of course, when so many people died, it's immoral to say that this balance is on our side. But if we use primarily geopolitical logic, Russia gained more because it got closer to China, closer to Iran, closer to India. It stopped the expansion of NATO. Now NATO will understand that if they expand to Georgia or, heaven forbid, to Armenia or Azerbaijan, it's going to be terrible. They just won't even try to do it. Before they pretended that they don't notice Russia's objections. If you want me to tell you who is basically to blame for this war, I will tell you, there was a woman from the United States, Angela Stent, who came to Russia several times for Valdai Club discussions. And she was a member of Obama's and George Bush, Jr.'s teams on arms negotiations with Russia. So I remember very well how dozens of times she was told that NATO expansion was dangerous. And then recently, she gave an interview to Der Spiegel magazine in Germany. And they asked her, don't you think that NATO expansion was a mistake, that it provoked Russia into doing what you dislike so much with Ukraine? She said, no, because when NATO expanded to the Baltics, there was no resistance from Putin. There was no reaction from him. And I was just thought, Jesus, I remember under my very eyes, you were told 5 or 6 times, by Karaganov, by Nikonov, by all the other people, you were told several times that this is inadmissible. Russia cannot stand it. NATO expansion has to stop. It is dangerous to have NATO in the Baltics. And now she says, no, that was all. I didn't notice that. So the problem with these people is that they only notice when there are terrorist attacks or wars. When you just send letters, make statements, they pretend that you don't exist. They don't react to them. So these people's fault is huge. They were like the children who play with with the electric cables, pretending not to notice that there is a current there, that you can die, from the electric shock. But they were not children. They were grown up, irresponsible American neocons.
Do you think that this war could have been avoided if Putin interfered in that coup in Ukraine in 2014?
Of course. There would be other problems because the West would not forgive any kind of interference. They interfered on a massive scale. Certainly, the fact that Putin and Russia in general did not protest under Yanukovych, under Yushchenko, even under Kuchma, there was a constant anti-Russian propaganda in Ukrainian schools. Several generations were raised in hatred of Russia. And Putin, he is a lawyer. So for him, it was like, okay, according to the law, this is another country. They have their history textbooks. They have their press. They have their television. I'm not going to interfere. The important things are going to be decided between politicians. No. Public opinion is very important. And you should not allow propaganda against your country. If you know that it is taking place, you should react. So Putin also, and Yanukovych to a great extent, they underestimated the importance of public opinion in Ukraine.
You see that finally Putin, let's talk about this military operation in Ukraine. Finally, after failing these negotiations that Putin tried so hard, in my opinion, to get something out of these discussions, these peace talks, he decided to go in Ukraine. When he started this, everyone was thinking that it's going to be over so quickly. But when you look at the forces, look at the soldiers, troops that went to Ukraine, something like 100,000 soldiers went there,
125,
with
very
very
few.
small amount of soldiers inside Ukraine. What was the plan in the first place?
Well, this was a huge technical miscalculation, which I think Putin is unwilling to admit. If I were him, I would have admitted it. There were just, I have a friend who was from Kharkov, that Ukrainian city with Russian population next to the border with Russia. Yanukovych fled there after the putschists, took his residence in Kiev, and he was met there by locals, by the people who said, we are from the east. Kharkov was the second capital of the east after Donetsk. And a friend of mine, Sergei Moiseyev, he was a political refugee from there. He had to flee after the Maidan. Kharkov also rebelled against Maidan, but they didn't have any weapons, so they were pretty quickly reoccupied by Ukrainian troops. And when February 2022 came, he was right there on the border, which shows that Lavrov might not know about the invasion, but the Ukrainian refugees knew. So it's amazing. Putin trusted them more than his own diplomats. I'm sure that Lavrov, when he assured people that Russia would not attack, he was not lying. He just didn't have that information. And Moiseyev told me that initially there were several buses with policemen from Russia, guys from Rosgvardia, Russian Guard, with truncheons and glass shields, the ones that you use against riots, against hooligans. The idea was that the Ukrainian army would not resist, that they would not dare to shoot, to kill, the same people as them. They would enter the city. Maybe there will be some discontent people, old women might come to kiss them, and younger men, like football fans, might be disturbed. So they would gently use their glass shields and truncheons and just throttle them away, And in reality, Kharkov is one of the best armed and equipped with all kinds of weapons. Russia does not even dream of taking it in the near future, right? So the Moiseyev told me that they fired from missiles against these buses with the policemen. The policemen just fled in the very beginning. But it shows you what kind of expectations the Putin and his circle had. They underestimated the power of Ukrainian totalitarianism and propaganda. Again, they didn't believe the political science textbooks. Political science textbooks may tell you, Russians knew, and it is really indeed so, that Zelensky's government was ineffective. The country was very poor. He was unpopular. He was corrupt. He was unprofessional. But it doesn't mean, in a totalitarian state, it doesn't mean that this government would be subdued easily by an outside attack. Totalitarian governments can resist outside attacks. And yes, the army that Putin sent, well, I mean, the reform that we had in the Russian army, basically it copied the Western reforms. The idea was that we don't need a huge army to defend a huge country. We would need 2 or 3 expeditionary corpses, like 100,000 people here, 100,000 people over there, 100,000 people in the north. Enough, If these are young people who can fight, we don't need a lot of infrastructure. We don't need to take care of the families. We just take the contractors, we take the professionals, and that's going to work. It worked in Syria. Syria is a relatively small country compared to Ukraine. Ukraine is 40 million people now. officially 46. Under the Soviet Union, it was more than 50 million. Now it is still a huge country, much bigger than Syria, much bigger than Lebanon. So in this situation, the expeditionary force was just laughable. It was like sending the same troops you sent to take New Caledonia to invade Spain. You know.
But do you think?
So yes, it was a miscalculation.
But it was a miscalculation. But if you look at this, it seems that Putin, even after this, after going into Ukraine, he was still hoping for peace talks. He was showing his seriousness toward the West that he's gonna do this, but he was still hoping for peace talks. Do you think this was the reason for his miscalculation?
Part of it, yes. Well, basically, the Russian government has the following problem. The plan, starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union, was basically that relations with the West would improve with time. The idea was that all hostility is the result of Stalin's actions, certain things that the Soviet Union or maybe even the Russian Empire did wrong. So we just need to apologize for that. And after all, Russia's attitude to Western foreigners is so good. If you come to Russia, you're going to see people still love Americans. They still love the British. They love the French. They had good relations with Germans. Now it is starting to change a little bit, but very slowly. And in the 90s, the attitude to Western foreigners was very good. So the idea was that all hostility, these are just rudiments of the Cold War. They will go away. I said, even then, in the 90s, that you're wrong. They are not rudiments. Look, they're getting bigger. The rudiments are not supposed to get bigger. If rudiments are getting bigger, it means something is wrong with your theory. I think Putin and his people did not want to believe the worst. And the worst is what I believe, that the West now is in the grips of a very radical new ideology, which is not Nazi, it's not communist, it is ultra-liberal. In fact, there are three kinds of totalitarianism that the world knows. They all stem from previously respected, nice ideologies, nice sets of ideas. The Nazi totalitarianism came from European nationalism, which had its romantic side, opera, folklore, Homeric poems, all these Hectors, Achilles, fighting for their motherland, all that stuff, right? And then the terrible primitivization in the Nazi Reich. The communist dictatorship, the communist totalitarianism had even nobler origins. Great socialist thinkers of the 19th century, Liebknecht, Marx, Engels, very nice people. But their ideas were, at the moment when the communists decided to become a world power and to go into China, to go into Russia, poor peasant countries, of course their ideas were badly distorted. And we had this second totalitarianism, the communist one. But there was always this powerful third ideology, liberalism, which had even better origins. There are nice post-war economic and social reforms in Europe. The United States as a relatively successful project in the middle of the 20th century, the best countries in the world, and even that ideology was distorted. It turned out that you can make it a parody of itself, just like you make the Nazism a parody of European nationalism, and like you made Stalinism a parody of what Marx and Liebknecht wanted to do. So there was this terrible new ideology against us. Unfortunately, this ideology perceives Russia, China, Iran as irreconcilable enemies which need to be destroyed politically. If it's impossible to destroy them from within, then you can destroy them even physically, because they are hampering the world's development. And the reason I understand why Putin did not want to believe this, his generation of Soviet people was raised at a moment, at a time of history when ideology looked like a facade that no one paid attention to, No one paid attention to Mr. Brezhnev's belief in communism. It could be sincere, but people understood that the boss determines the ideology. Gorbachev came to power, suddenly we had this socialism with a human face. Okay, then Yeltsin came to power, liberalism became the word of the day. So ideologies changed together with leaders. And in this situation, Putin simply did not have experience that would tell him that ideology can be powerful. It can be powerful. It was powerful in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. And the West, if you want to look at the copies, whom does the West resemble? It doesn't resemble the late Soviet Union of Brezhnev and Gorbachev. It resembles the early Soviet Union of Lenin and Stalin, And now it's somewhere between Lenin and Stalin. Repressions are taken, aggressiveness is growing, repressions are growing. The fact that they have no decent leader in the United States makes them even more suspicious and aggressive. The Soviet system was most aggressive at the moment when Lenin died and Stalin had not yet become the powerful leader. They felt like we're left without the leader. This is the danger. They barked and attacked anyone who looked like a distant threat in the mid-20s. So United States and the European Union, they're in their mid-20s now. But believing in it is very hard because Russians were tired of the old Cold War. They wanted to live better. People were starting to live better in the 2000s, in the 2010s. People were living better and better. They didn't want this to end. And when suddenly you need to mobilize and fight for your dignity, it was very hard to awaken people, especially the young ones. Wake up, your life is in danger. You have to fight for survival. No, I want to drink Coke and I want to travel abroad and I want to lead the life as usual. Why? My parents have been living that life for 20 years. Why should I suddenly make sacrifices? It's very difficult to explain to people. And a minority of Russians who oppose Putin now, if you listen to their arguments, none of their arguments are deep. It's never humanistic. It's never deep. It's usually just like, couldn't we just let it go as it went? Couldn't we just not touch it? No, you couldn't, because things were developing in their own way, and they were getting more and more dangerous. And maybe the fact that we woke up in 2022 saved us from the worst, because the worst would be if we did not react and did not react and did not react. And then, the West is already very close to St. Petersburg. Estonia is 100 miles away from St. Petersburg. If they took Ukraine, they would be 200 miles from Moscow. It's very close. So in this situation, the sooner you wake up, the better.
You see, if you see at the U.S. ideology, if it's come from Wolfowitz doctrine, see, it didn't change that much. It's almost the same. In 1992, this Wolfowitz doctrine came out. Russia is the biggest enemy of us. In this doctrine, it says clearly. Then you see Putin came after Yeltsin. Could you explain to our audience, from your point of view, what was Russia look like when Putin took power in Russia?
Well, it is now very fashionable in Russia to criticize the 90s, to present them as some sort of a nightmare. I was a young man then, so my impressions are very, I would say, and I was a reporter, a newspaper reporter. A newspaper reporter at the time was not someone who sits at a computer like now. A newspaper reporter was someone who went to the streets, who went to distant cities, distant towns, went to the villages. So I saw Russia at the time. And I can tell you that the worst time was late 80s, when the Soviet system was just stopping to work. And there was a shortage of everything, There were shortages of meat in the 70s, but in the 80s there was already a shortage of cheese, a shortage of socks. There was a moment when tobacco disappeared, and you can imagine, the shock of people, the smokers. Suddenly they were left without cigarettes. No, the worst time was under Gorbachev, and it was a huge. I remember this discrepancy. The West kept talking about new winds of change, and for Russians it was a terrible time because the basic necessities were absent. The 90s, somehow everything became available, okay, at a price, yes, much more expensive than before, but I don't remember any of my family members being hungry or fearing what they would do next week or next month. And it was typical for 1989, 1990. People did not know what would happen next month. And if you look at the immigration, the biggest wave of immigration was 1990, 1991. Well, a part of it is explained by the fact that until then it was almost impossible to immigrate unless you married some Jewish woman or you yourself had Jewish relatives. So there was a what we call a postponed migration. Suddenly the gates were opened, and people who would have immigrated back in the 70s, they immigrated in 1990. But still, I remember it was huge. The amount of people who left in 1990 was huge. It was nothing compared to 1999. And by the end of Yeltsin's rule, the economic reforms were almost complete, and yes, there was this terrible financial crisis, which is Yeltsin's responsibility because he basically borrowed money to win the election in 1996, and then he refused to return that money. So the whole default was Yeltsin refusing to return the money he borrowed from the banks, and which meant from the investors back in 1996 without asking them. Right? And when Putin came, it looked like the war in Chechnya would not end, at least during this generation. And Putin was just extremely lucky and extremely energetic. He ended the Chechen war in 6 or 7 months, something that very few people expected. He, his economic reforms were an instant success. His only problem was that he expected relations with the West to improve, and they just didn't want to. This was inexplicable to a lot of people. But he was a member of his generation. He didn't want another Cold War. He didn't want another isolation. So he kept postponing the showdown with the West until 2022. He may be even postponing it even now.
You see, when you describe this, it's completely describes how Putin was and how Putin is. He ended after 6 months this crisis in Chechnya, yeah, and he didn't want to start this war. And this guy is not what we see in the mainstream media. This guy, let's go kill Ukrainian. This is the guy who did everything to avoid this war. But I don't know why they're trying to make a new Hitler every time they want to smear somebody. They say this is a new Hitler coming in to destroy Europe, but nobody says Hitler where he was come from. Who has the ideology of Hitler right now?
Well, this is the problem. In totalitarian countries, the lie is not in details. In details, the Western media may be precise in the amount of oil that they report or in the exchange rates. The lie is at the very center, at the very core of what they report. In the Soviet Union, I remember it very well. They kept saying that Cuba is a free country, and then our Soviet writers returned from there and they said, there was a parade and Castro was just amazing. He was nice. But it was clear that people were kept in these squares and columns and under just glowing sun, in very difficult situation. And the writers saw it. So what they told was very much against what we were told by the media. What kind of island of freedom is that if such things are possible, right? In the same way when the Soviet media kept saying, oh, the Soviet Union, the Soviet people live better and better and better and better. No, they lived worse and worse. I remember it very well, and Putin remembers it very well. So in the same way, the Western media now, they may be precise in details, but they are wrong in the very idea of what they report. Their division of the world into democracies and autocracies. I have a very strong feeling that Turkey, for example, is a more democratic country. I see there a much greater variety of opinion than, say, I don't know, Germany now, where they're going to prohibit the most popular party, calling them new Hitlers and ultra-right and blah, blah, blah. And look at their program. They say that NATO, Alternative for Germany, they say that NATO should be, I quote, a purely defensive organization. They say that political correctness should not be used for artworks. I absolutely agree. They say that children at school should not be ideologized. I absolutely agree. But this is the total opposite of Nazism. This is precisely what Nazism could not stand. The idea that children should not be ideologically, molded at school. It's people of my generation, people who lived under the Soviet Union and then lived in the West and then lived in New Russia, we lived under 3 different regimes. So we know how the lies are created, and we're almost cynical about lies. We understand that there is no political regime in the world that can exist without lies. Just like any religion always speaks about miracles, but it doesn't mean that all religions are equally good. They are different. And of course, it doesn't mean that you should discard the religious side in your life simply because, yes, this water may not be magic, and this relic may not heal you instantly, Just you must have an idea and belief, and you must feel the vector of the universe. If you go with that vector, sooner or later, everything will be fine, according to the laws of physics, without breaking the laws of physics and chemistry. So I don't require from any political regime, I don't require complete democracy, Just like I will never say that I want to live in a society with zero family violence. People, when they live in families, of course there is violence. Of course, because people have to coexist, But the conclusion that the West is making from that is absolutely crazy. They want to make it zero violence. Zero family violence means zero family. When people will start living without families, there will be no family violence. But there will be no new life without families. So this is the problem with this new totalitarian Western society.
Actually, they're trying to paint Ukraine as a democracy. I don't know if it is a democracy because Zelensky is not willing to have any election in Ukraine until this war is over. Do you see in U.S. national strategy, security strategy, they call about autocracies and democracies? They say we are democracies, we are fighting for democracy. Russia, China, these are autocracies. This is the rhetoric they have. They have the same thing in Ukraine. They're killing young Ukrainians, people that have nothing to do with this war. They're fighting this war for no reason. They're getting killed for no reason. You see, if they were willing to negotiate with Russia, there would be no destruction of Ukraine. How do you see this new strategy of Zelensky in Ukraine, that he's not willing to have an election?
Well, talking about freedom, I think you cannot measure freedom in any units, and it's stupid to classify the countries as free, partially free, 60% free, 70% free. I know a lot of Azerbaijanis, for example, young people from Azerbaijan who live in Baku, and they live in the United States, and they live in Germany, and they return to Moscow. And I asked them, where did you feel yourself free? Wasn't it in the United States? He said, no, not in the United States. Definitely not in the United States. Why? Because freedom is something in the air, if you feel like you can't say this and you can't say that, you must call certain people, people with limited abilities and not just invalids or, sick people. But when you have to check your words every second. I had that feeling. I was standing with my Azerbaijani friend at an airport, a small airport inside the United States. Most of the people there were probably flying to their jobs. And I felt like I was among paratroopers, People were so quiet, they were so concentrated, they were obviously preparing for work. I felt like I was among soldiers. I had a completely different feeling in Baku in an airport. Maybe people there were also leaving for their jobs in Russia, in other places, but they were so relaxed. and they were so happy, they were traveling. So it's something imperceptible. But I can tell you what kind of freedom they have in Ukraine. I think Ukraine, it kind of combines all sorts of bad things from the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, from the West. Basically prohibiting all Russian movies about army and police and about the Soviet power. It's like, you live in Canada and you prohibit all the American movies about Clint Eastwood, Sylvester Stallone, because they're all about police and they're all about soldiers, former soldiers, and they're all, to a bigger and lesser extent, they propagandize American way of life. What kind of life will be in Canada? They say, in the West, they say, oh, the Soviet Union was bad because Dos Passos and the great writer John Steinbeck was partially prohibited in the Soviet Union. Not all of his works, just his last novel On Mice and Men, because it was anti-Soviet or something. Okay, what part did Steinbeck play in the life of an average Russian worker, Soviet worker? Minuscule, maybe one in 2,000, one in 3,000 read him. And if you prohibit Russian movies, classical Russian movies in Ukraine, you are stealing a huge part of that person's childhood, young years. That's why there are so many people who support Russia. That's why there are all these tragedies. There are always people who report to the Russian army, where are the German tanks? Where is the train with artillery shells from Britain? So Russians pinpoint strike at the train, strike at the depots where these weapons are stored. Why? Because there are so many people in Ukraine who are unhappy. And they're unhappy not because they're not necessarily even Russian speakers. They may be ethnic Ukrainians. But you stole 2/3 of my life because I want to watch these movies, not on internet. I want to watch them on television. I want to watch them in cinemas. They prohibited 90% of Russian pop singers. It's like, you're not allowing Bruce Springsteen and Madonna and all the others. You're not allowing them to come to Canada, and you're not allowed to listen to them. So the censorship there is terrible. It's absurd. Even the Western correspondents agree. And the idea that people, all the films had to be dubbed in Ukrainian, even though everyone in Ukraine understood Russian. It's like you force people in Canada to dub all the films in French and watch them only in French, maybe with subtitles. So, of course, it's not a democracy, and it's very unfortunate because Ukraine was a democracy for many years, and somehow they resolved that problem, East and West. It seemed to me that this is going to be a perennial problem that they will somehow resolve. The reason why Yanukovych, the reason why Kuchma were so unwilling to make a choice between Russia and the European Union. Russia did not force them to make the choice. Russia said, let's work together so that we can get into the European Union together, rich and stronger, under better conditions. It was the European Union that said either us or them. It was Günther Verheugen who first said it in 2003, and then all the others repeated it. So the problem with the problem that Yanukovych and the Kuchma had to face was if they tilt to the European Union, then the East falls off. Imagine a donkey which is carrying 2 sacks of sand with a very thin line connecting them. If you go too much on the left, the right sacks fall down. If you go too much on the right, the left sack falls down. So they were always ambivalent about it. Even Yushchenko was ambivalent. He did not want to go full speed to the West because he understood that this could lead to this separation of East Ukraine. And this was resolved inside a democracy. Ukraine was a democracy. But when it stopped to be a democracy, it became an unending tragedy. Just an unending tragedy.
You see, in this war in Ukraine, when Ukraine started this counteroffensive against Russia, everything was in favor of Russia, and we were seeing the news talking about in mainstream media, in other news outlets, but suddenly something came along. Prigozhin is marching toward Moscow. He's going to make a rebellion movement in Russia. I want to know, this is the same guy he was calling on Shoigu, send more weapons here, we need more weapons. And finally, we see this guy out of nowhere. He's telling that he's gonna take Shoigu down. How do you see this? How did it start? Why did Putin not cut it from the beginning?
Well, because I think it is becoming obvious. A lot of people just don't want Putin to feel bad. They're not telling him the whole information. It is clear, and he's a smart man, and he tries to get to the bottom of things. But he obviously kind of left it outside his attention. For example, the situation with a lot of media in Russia, which was very anti-Russian, very pro-Western, absolutely, total traitors, and now most of them are abroad. Some of the people who were in the state-owned media, the West said, oh, state-owned media in Russia are terrible. After 2022, a lot of them operate from the Baltic countries in the anti-Russian centers there. People who got state salaries, people who headed state media companies here. So obviously Putin we knew they were anti-Russian. And some of us thought maybe it's some kind of a complicated game, Putin wants he wants to hear their opinion. No, Putin just wanted different media in the country. And he did not suppress any liberal media. Some extremely nationalist media were suppressed, Did you notice that you don't hear anything about Russian skinheads? They were very active in the late 90s. After 2 or 3 years of Putin, they just disappeared, because he put the worst ones in jail and he shut down their media outlets. Without that, they're dead, But there is no anti-black movement in Russia now, almost no anti-black violence. And with Prigozhin, I think just, Putin was the head of St. Petersburg Foreign Trade Department in the 90s, when St. Petersburg was a very criminal city. I think it was then that they got acquainted with Prigozhin. And Prigozhin just lost orientation, you know. If you look at the movies that he made, if you look at the media outlets that he made, it was not patriotic, it was not Christian, it was like a Superman. There was something Nietzschean about his attitude to his people. It was very bad taste, and it had to end badly. I'm glad that it ended without hundreds of people being killed. I'm glad that he's out now, and this terrible situation when he said terrible things about Shoigu and others. I'm glad that it ended, and I think Putin is stronger after this because no one supported Prigozhin. He was completely isolated. Just these trucks moving towards Moscow. It was clear that they were allowed to move simply because Putin did not want people to get killed. Otherwise, I mean, okay, even if he entered the Kremlin, what would he do there? How would he govern the country? All the governors were against him. You know, he wouldn't know which phone receiver to pick up. It's like, that story with Nadezhda Savchenko, the terrible Ukrainian woman soldier who was accused of letting Ukrainian artillery know where the journalists were killed, Russian journalists. When she was returned, the West demanded her release. The Russian liberals demanded her release. So when she came back to Ukraine, she was elected into the Rada, and a lot of people said, oh, how awful, she's in the Rada, a nationalist in the Rada. And our journalist, Mikhail Sinelnikov, a Russian living in Kiev, he said, okay, she's in the Rada. What is she going to do there? She's going to get bored because she comes there, she has no education, There are guys there in neckties, in nice suits, sitting. They have legal education, they know economics. They change one comma in the text, $23 billion goes somewhere. They enjoy it, they know it. She doesn't know. And it was precisely what happened. She started to get bored, and then she started to do stupid things like, in my woman's bag, I have a grenade, Finally, she got in jail, and she sat in Ukrainian jail longer than in Russian jail. And no one in the West gives a damn. Again, just, to tell you about the standards of the West. One Yulia Tymoshenko for them was more important than tens of thousands of people who got killed in Eastern Ukraine. One person was more important. Because of her, they were ready to impose sanctions on Ukraine and not to sign that association agreement. The fact that 15,000 of people died back in 2014, for them it was nothing. They signed the deal, and they never mentioned how many people were killed in Donetsk. Or they just said that only Russians are to blame for their deaths.
Do you think MI6 or CIA was behind Prigozhin's movement?
I don't think so. He was stupid enough himself. If you look at him, he was just losing orientation. He was a small Napoleon. It's amazing how people lose their consciousness, lose their sense of limits during a war, because you see so many tragedies and you feel yourself so powerful. You destroy cities, So he was a typical victim of a war in his own way.
And how about this war? Do you think that Russia gonna get Odessa, gonna go toward western part of Ukraine? Because it seems to me that West not gonna give up on sending weapons to Ukraine. They're gonna send more weapons to Ukraine. I don't know if Ukraine gonna have manpower to fight this battle, but they're gonna send more weapons and more weapons. And as long as this war going on, it's gonna be more dangerous in some nuclear escalations.
To be frank with you, I don't know. But let me give you this estimate. It will continue until there will be a danger for Russia, an immediate danger coming from Ukraine. And because of the West's attitude, that may continue for a long time. And so Russia will be pushing towards the western border of Ukraine as the Western hostility grows. If the Western hostility is the same as now, or even it grows, Russia will have no other choice but to shut off Ukraine completely. Because the reason why Russia started this operation in 2022, part of it, I think it was not only for Russia, it was for the world. If Ukraine is completely controlled by the West, and if it is a country hostile to Russia, in case of a conflict between Russia and the West, Russia would have to switch to the nuclear option immediately. Because Ukraine is so close, it's not far from Moscow. It's 3 hours by train. So we're coming back to the times of medieval period, when the so-called Grand Duchess of Lithuania Grand Duchy of Lithuania was threatening Moscow, and it was a bigger country than Moscow itself. So basically, the more West is insisting Putin should not win this war, the more they are leaving him no other choice but to win it, because it becomes an existential problem for Russia. And the West will not get seriously involved because the West is not prepared for the kind of war that we're having with Ukraine right now. It's nothing like the Persian Gulf. It's much bloodier and messier.
Thank you so much, Dmitry, for being with us today. We discussed a lot of things, a lot of misunderstanding in this war in Ukraine.
It was pleasant to talk to you because you really want to know, you listen to the end, and you raise important issues. So this is what I call real journalism. The main thing is to listen, to be interested. And the other important thing is to know what you're talking about. Unfortunately, in the West, these things are getting more and more in deficit.